Yes.
Dr. Nestor Baker?
Yes.
Mrs. Davidson?
Yes.
Mrs. Altman?
Yes. And so now we move into our work session. Welcome. Welcome.
Thank you to the rest of our cabinet team for joining us for this discussion.
Another presentation. All right, are you ready? Ready as we'll ever be. Okay, so as promised, I have another PowerPoint to sort of just highlight. You have a couple of handouts. You have the copy of the presentation that's in front of you tonight, and then you have another handout that has a couple of scenarios for the ballot millage. So before we get into all that, though, I want to go through a couple of things just to make sure that the board and the vast majority of people that are watching understand like what we're dealing with as we're
Sorry, I'm taking everybody's papers.
no, you're fine, as we're looking at a potential ballot issue this fall. So a little bit about Westerville Schools for, I know everyone up here is probably familiar, but we educate about 14,600 students. We employ 2,000 people. We have a $212 million operating budget. We have 20 total van routes that drive over 300,000 miles annually. We have 99 total bus routes that drive 1 million miles annually. Like I mentioned earlier, our fiscal year runs July 1st through June 30th. We have annual audits by the Auditor of State, who we spend about 6 months out of the year with. We serve over 1.2 million lunches annually to our kiddos and over 500,000 breakfasts. This is our footprint, if you haven't seen it before. Here's our footprint with all of our political subdivisions. So we work with 2 different counties, Delaware to the north, Franklin to the south. We also have the city of Westerville, Genoa Township, Blendon Township, city of Columbus, village of Minerva Park, and a small portion of Sharon Township. We have 4 union groups and 3 non-union groups. When we talk about our 2,000 employees, you can see the breakdown of the different groups and who all we have. The bottom there, the contracted employees, those are instructional aides and teacher substitutes that we talked about through the Educational Service Center of Ohio. This is a makeup of our student population as reported on the 2023 district report card. As you can see in 2023, we had 15.9% of students with disabilities, 37.8% students considered economically disadvantaged, and 10.5% English learners. This is a graph that Mr. Dorn put together, if he's up, showing the growth in our economically disadvantaged numbers. So our numbers really didn't drop in fiscal year 21 and 22. That was when we had lunch at no cost. The federal government was supporting lunch at no cost for all students, so we saw a reduction in the people that were filling out forms for the school lunch and breakfast program. Actually, I don't think we were allowed to let them, we weren't allowed to require them to. And that number has increased significantly this year. The state has changed the way it is directly identifying students for the breakfast and school lunch program. They're using Medicaid numbers now, which I think has increased that number significantly. And this is our special education enrollment over the last couple of decades, and our English learners enrollment over the last couple of decades. And our top, you can see the list of our top languages in Westerville schools, and I believe we have 64 different languages in the district that our students speak. If you're not familiar with our facilities, we have 3 high schools, 5 middle schools now, 15 elementary schools, and many other buildings that our facilities and buildings team do an awesome job of maintaining our 2.4 million square feet. Our general fund revenue, 63% are made up of local property taxes, 25% state funding, and 12% other. For our general fund expenditures, 72% are spent on direct instruction and support, 9% are spent on administration and Board of Education. Administration also includes our building administrators, not just our district level. Business operations, utilities, things to keep the lights on, the buildings up and running. Student support, student transportation is 6%. Fiscal services, the county auditor and treasurer do charge us a rather large fee for collecting our property taxes for us, and then 2% for extracurricular activities. So when Governor Kasich was in office, I think this was in the Columbus Dispatch, when they were talking about how simple the new school funding formula would be. So in 1997, 2000, 2001, and 2002, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled school funding in Ohio unconstitutional every year of those years. And then in 2002, they finally just said they weren't going to look at this anymore, and we'd have to bring a new case before them if we wanted to continue to look at it. And it was ruled unconstitutional. It was a DeRolf case. If anybody that's been in this world for any amount of time has probably heard of this. But it was due to the over-reliance on local property taxes, and also not really being a formula, but being residual budgeting by the state. And residual budgeting is essentially, this is all the things we want to spend our money on. What's left over, we'll give that to the schools. That's sort of what residual budgeting is, instead of being based on any sort of calculation. Since 1990, fiscal year 1990, these are all the various funding models we've had from the state. Our current state budget is the one on the bottom. We have the Fair School Funding Plan, which we talked about using 2022 cost data. So the Fair School Funding Plan was created, so Representative, he was Speaker of the House at the time, I think, when it really got into law, but Bob Cupp was on the House of Representatives. John Patterson was a state senator. They worked together. Patterson is Democrat, Cupp is a Republican. It was a nonpartisan effort to get school practitioners, superintendents, treasurers, and various people from school districts across the state to put together a school funding formula based on what does it actually cost to educate a child in today's world in Ohio. So they came up with the Fair School Funding Plan. It was a lot of work over several years from a lot of people. And you can see the base cost includes all of those things in the bar graph and everything down below. And anything not in the base cost, so like special education, gifted English learners, that's considered categorical funding, and that's over and above the base cost. And it'd be great if they would fund it, right? So you saw this earlier. This is how they have implemented the Fair School Funding Plan, not fully funding it. So local capacity is the measure of the district's, this is from OD's website, a measure of each school district's ability to raise revenue locally to determine the state and local share of the cost of education for each student. So this measure uses both property wealth and resident income of the district to calculate a unique local capacity per pupil amount for each district. And we saw this here. So our calculated percentage has decreased since 2021 going into next year by 20%. Just from this year to next year is 7% because the state updated the local property wealth calculation. And this is just something you've already seen. So for the funding formula, and I say this a lot, but I just want to make sure that everybody hears it at least once. The state continues to look to school districts whenever they want to save money or cut funds. And they also look to public school districts to meet all of our socioeconomical requirements that our students have, the well-being, the wraparound services, all of the things. We are the first line of defense for anything. But then we're also the first place they look whenever they want to make cuts. It's a huge frustration that I have. So moving on to property taxes, there are two different property tax types, real property and personal property. So real property is broken out into Class 1 and Class 2. Class 1 is basically residential homeowners and farmers, agricultural. And then Class 2 is our commercial and industrial. And then personal property is our public utility tangible personal property. And that's changed significantly over the years too. If you look at our total general operating revenue by percentage, we get 76% of our property tax revenue from residential and agricultural. 20% comes from commercial and industrial, and 4% comes from public utility personal. Real property taxes levied on all property within the district. Assessed value is 35% of the property value. It essentially means that how your bill is calculated for your tax bill is based on 35% of your property's actual value as determined by the county auditor. The county auditor reappraises property every 6 years, so 2023 was our reappraisal year in Franklin and Delaware counties. And then there's an update every third year in between. Personal property taxes. These are taxes levied on any public utility tangible personal property. Public utilities include electric, rural electric, natural gas, pipeline, waterworks, transportation, heating, and telegraph companies. And these values are determined by the tax commissioner. Prior to, I want to say it was 2004, the state, we did have a personal property tax on businesses, and the state eliminated that tax for businesses, and they reimbursed schools for a period of time, and then they phased that reimbursement out. Oh, look at that, I have a note about it. Beginning in 2004, and the phase out ended in 2009. Oh, sorry. So this is, you can see the shift from personal property to real estate property taxes over that time period. Dr. Howard Fleeter is an expert on school funding, Ohio property taxes, all the things. He's been around a long time. He's a chief economist, does a lot of research on a lot of things. This was one of his slides from one of the group presentations he gave for our three associations, OASBO, BASA, and OSBA. And this just highlights the shift in the school tax base. So looking at who holds the burden of the property tax costs. So back in 1975, Class 1, so homeowners and farmers, they held 46.1% of the cost of the property taxes, and the businesses were at 53.9%. And so that's been a 20% shift the other way since that time as of 2022. And this is at the state level. This is overall for the whole state. And that is a direct result of the state's policy on property tax allocation. So this is the state share of local property taxes we talked about a little bit with the forecast. Homestead exemption, so this exempts a portion of the market value for low-income senior citizens and also disabled Ohioans. And that is an amount that changes with inflation. It was $25,000 this year. I think it's a little over $26,000. The state, there's at least one, maybe two bills that the state is looking at that will adjust the homestead exemption. Right now, the state reimburses school districts for any revenue loss from that exemption. The one bill I know, House Bill 187, would only reimburse us at 50% 50% of the lost revenue. And then the rollback for non-business property owners, which is essentially homeowners, we had a 10% non-business credit and a 2.5% owner-occupied credit that the state also reimburses the schools for. So that rollback was eliminated, the 10 and the 2.5% was eliminated for all levies approved after September of 2013. So any levy on the ballot after September of 2013 automatically became 12.5% more expensive to those folks. And these reimbursements are subject to the state legislature. What are we talking about when we say assessed value? So assessed value is just 35% of the market value as determined by the county auditor. So a $200,000 home in market value would have a $70,000 assessed value. And that's the value that the county auditor looks at when they are calculating property tax bills. What is a millage? Millage is simply a term that the state of Ohio uses for property taxes. A mill, a number of mills is the tax rate or the effective tax rate. So it's just the unit of measurement that we use. 1 mill is 1/1000th of a dollar, or $1 for every $1,000. So the cost of a mill to property owners, a $100,000 home would be 35% of that, times 1 mill is $35. So 1 mill costs $35 per $100,000. So if I estimate costs of millage to property owners, I did a table here. So if the millage is 3.9, a market value of $100,000 would be $136.50. And this is an annual cost. And then 500,000 would be $682.50. I do want to make sure that I mentioned there's a big asterisk there, that these amounts will absolutely vary. Like, this math never works out perfectly because of the way reappraisals work and House Bill 920, which we'll get into here. Common types of property tax levies used by schools. So we have millage-based. It's primarily used for operating expenses or permanent improvement funding, which is subject to the tax reduction factor, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Emergency levies, those are limited operating levies. You can do them for a maximum of 10 years. It's a fixed sum levy that keep revenues constant regardless of valuation changes. So that includes new construction. It does not see growth with new construction. Substitute levies replaces an existing emergency levy and allows for growth with new construction. Essentially turns it into a millage-based levy, which allows it to grow with new construction. Bond issues, these are specific dollar amounts to be borrowed to finance construction, other permanent improvements. Maximum term is 40 years, and the millage is based on whatever repayment schedule of any debt that's issued. Maximum term's 40 years. Legal counsel, like when we work with developing a resolution for a bond issue, if you're doing just buildings, it would be 40 years, but if you throw in like equipment or furniture or anything like that, they usually limit you to 37 years based on a useful life of the improvements. Other types of levies are dual purpose levies. So this is a single ballot issue for permanent improvement levy combined with an operating levy. Bond issue combination. So this is what we did in 2019 that I am recommending for this fall. So that's a bond issue that can be combined with an operating levy or a permanent improvement levy or both. And then incremental levy is a property tax phased in for the full amount of millage increase over the life of the levy, and there can be up to 10 millage changes, up to 5 millage changes during the phase in, but it's limited to up to 10 years. And that's a relatively new concept in law. It's only been around for a handful of years. Income tax levy options for schools. So we have the option under law to ask for a traditional income tax levy, and this is levied as a percentage on the district on the income of district residents or on taxable income of an estate, and revenue grows or decreases based on residents' income. Earned income tax levy is levied as a percentage only on earned income of district residents, so it includes investment or retirement income. Excludes, what'd I say? Did I say includes? Oh, excludes, I'm sorry. So schools are not able to, so cities, townships, villages, they can do income tax levies on businesses and workers, and also the residents too, but schools don't have the ability to tax businesses or workers like municipalities can. We can only tax our local residents. Thinking about House Bill 920 and millage. So inside millage, when we talk about that, that's our non-voted millage, and it was established by the Ohio Constitution. There's 10 mills for overlapping jurisdictions that was shared back in the 30s. Our portion of that 10 mills is 3.8 mills for Westerville schools. Any millage above that has to be voted on by our taxpayers, and this is known as outside millage. So what House Bill 920 does is it prevents revenue from growing on those voted levies by reducing the millage rates as values increase. This is just a very simple up and down arrow, but as property values increase, tax rates decrease, and on any existing properties, so that revenue remains relatively the same. So I have, if you'll bear with me, a few slides that I'm trying to show this. So the math isn't perfect, but this is essentially the idea behind House Bill 920 and how it works. So this is, imagine this is a county of 10 properties, and every two properties is a neighborhood in that county. So, and reappraisals and updates are every 3 years, but I'm going year 1, 2, 3 just to follow along. So in my county of 10 properties, we have various property values. Property 1's at $450,000, property 10's at $338,800. Their tax rate is 45 mills, and then you can see the property tax due on all of those properties. That's before any exemptions or anything like that. Is $62,566. So that's the revenue that the school district receives in this scenario. So we have a reappraisal, and neighborhood 1 saw a 35% increase. The neighborhood with properties 3 and 4 saw a 25% increase, and you can see so on and so on. On average, the whole county saw a 21% increase, but each neighborhood saw a different increase in their property values. So when we look at year 2 with the updated values, we still only want to generate that amount of revenue. So what the county does is they adjust that tax rate. So instead of 45 mills, the tax rate that they're going to use to calculate the property tax bill is now 37.25 mills. And so that change for the school district is $4, or for the county, whereas properties 1 and 2 saw rather large increases in their property tax bills, and then properties 5, 6, 7, and 8 actually saw a decrease in their property tax bill. So that's how House Bill 920 works, and how your property bill fluctuates depending on how your value changes compared to your neighborhood, compared to the rest of the county. So then we go into the next year, so we're carrying that 37.25 rate, and then we see a different value change. So this time properties 1 and 2 only saw a 5%, properties 9 and 10 are at 35%. And so again, we still want to receive the same amount of revenue, so the county does the calculation and they say, okay, what do we need to set the rate at? And then that's what they set the rate at. So the 30.71 mills is now our new rate, and you can see the shift in those calculations based on the tax bill. So that's how that works. So when I say we see some growth on new construction, the way that works is if we take that same example where we started with a tax rate of 37.25%, on average still a 21% increase, but now we added property 11, So the county is still going to calculate that same rate of 30.71 mils, but now they're going to apply it to that new construction, which is going to give us that little bit of a bump in revenue, which, if all things worked in a perfect world and math were that easy, that would be great. But then we also have many other things that look at, we might have tax abatements for community reinvestment areas, or tax dollars diverted for tax increment financing agreements, those sorts of things. So if that happens, then that looks a lot different, and we might not see that growth from new construction. That was a lot. Does that make sense? Everybody follow that? Any questions about that? Anyone?
Not a question, but I would just add in on the new construction, also if it's residential, that as you can see, if that house had even one student, it would not be generating enough taxes to pay for the education of that one student in a year. So a lot of times people see the new pretty neighborhoods go in and they think, oh, the school's getting a huge windfall. But if they have students in those houses that need educated, it actually usually comes at a deficit in terms of the revenue for us.
Yeah, that's very true.
And don't we still have a delay from the time that the new construction comes along until we begin to collect those
It's
taxes?
in the next year,
Is
yeah.
it
Once it's
1 year, is it
set,
18 months? Yeah,
It's, yeah.
about a year.
So this was in the Columbus Dispatch for the 2023 reappraisal. Auditor Michael Stenziano with Franklin County published, these were the home value increases by school district in Franklin County. And I did reach out to them and I asked, and they said 30% of our homeowners in Westerville schools saw a decrease in their property tax bill. So while on average, property values increased by 38% for all of our residents in Franklin County, 30% saw a decrease in their tax bill, which is an example of what I just showed you, how that happens. So this is our property evaluation as a district by tax year. So tax years run on a calendar year, and you can see our update. We had an update, a full reappraisal in 2017. We saw a 12% increase in values, and then a triennial update in 2020 and 17% increase in values. And this 2023 reappraisal, so this is all property valuation, residential, commercial, public utility, all that. We're seeing a 33% increase in our values. So that's what the state's looking at when they're calculating our local capacity, that increase. This is property tax rates. So the purple line on the bottom, you can see that there, that is our inside millage. 3.8 mils, it doesn't change. It's been the same since the 30s. 3.8 mils, that will never change unless the state does something with the Constitution. The green line up above is our full voted mill. So this is what was on the ballot for everything that was voted by our electorate. And then the lines in between, so the orange line is our voted effective residential rate in agricultural. So that's that bottom line there. And then the other line, I couldn't tell you what color that is from here, is our voted effective rate for commercial and industrial property. So with our last levy that was approved in 2019 with delayed collections, we saw a triennial update with that. And so while our full millage increased by 5.9 mils, our commercial and industrial property saw a 1.3 mil increase, and our residential and agricultural actually saw a 1.2 mil decrease in their tax rates from that levy. So that's how that works with the values going up. And so overall, our property tax general operating revenues, you can see the percentage year over year. We had the new levy we saw a half-year collection in fiscal year 21 and a full-year collection in fiscal year 22. And that's why we see that increase in those years. And then the most recent update is generating around a 1.8% increase is estimated. Here's our graph again for state funding for schools. So last year, 2023, the state sent over $600 million to private schools while continuing to underfund public schools. This year, that number is estimated to be over $1 billion. And again, still not fully funding public schools. Just a reminder of what our graph looks like, if you want to bump that up to that. This document was put together by the Legislative Services Commission. The Legislative Services Commission is a non-partisan office that works for the legislature to sort of analyze bills and various things that our legislature does. And they were tasked with putting together requirements for different types of schools. So school districts on this table is traditional public schools, community schools or charter schools or community schools, and then STEM schools. And then the private schools are the chartered non-public schools or the non-chartered non-public schools. So this is a 9-page document, but I pulled out the state report card section. So on the state report cards, you can see all of the requirements that we have, community schools have, STEM schools have, and then our private schools have no requirements for state report cards. So when you hear someone in a hearing say, we want to give parents choice so that they can leave their poor performing public schools and go to a private school, they do not have any idea how the private school is performing, right? That is not measured anywhere. So that's just one example. This is a 9-page document. There's lots of examples of requirements between school districts, traditional school districts, and then private schools, if you want to peruse that. Just a note, public schools cannot charge for tuition for compulsory education. We can charge for consumable instructional materials like workbooks, lab materials, things like that. We do have to waive fees for any students eligible for free lunch under the National School Lunch and Breakfast Program. We can charge fees for participation in extracurricular activities and clubs. We do need to charge for fines for lost or damaged school items. Lunch or breakfast charges for students who don't qualify for free lunch and breakfast. We can charge tuition for all-day kindergarten, which we do as part of our all-day kindergarten program, but we cannot charge for half-day. And we can charge for preschool for students who aren't identified as having a disability. Just another note about public schools that private schools are not subject to. Our boards are elected by our community. That's why we have all you lovely people up here. Thank you. And then we are subject to public records disclosure. You can essentially request anything under public records law, and we are required to respond promptly to that request. We're subject to open meetings requirements. We are subject to licensure for staff and administrators. We're required to report data. All the data we do report, it's a lot, to the state's Educational Management Information System all throughout the year. And we're required to provide certain services to private schools. We are required to be audited by the state every year. We're required to participate in the state retirement systems. We have to have annual tax budgets, our 5-year forecast, which you just saw tonight. And most importantly, we are required to accept all students that live within our district boundaries, and we are not able to have an application process or turn students away for any reason. Their cost of education is our responsibility. Just to know about the retirement system, because I don't think everybody realizes this, schools are subject to the 2 different retirement systems. So we have the state teachers retirement system. Each employee contributes 14% of every paycheck that they receive to the school employee retirement system, and the Board of Education has a matching 14% that the district also contributes to the retirement system. Public school employees, our class, so state teachers is more like our certified, educationally certified school employees, and then the SERS, School Employees Retirement System, is our classified, non-educational employees. And so employees contribute 10% and the board contributes 14%. These are required contributions. Employees are, and the board is not able to opt out of it. School employees do not pay in Social Security, and private schools are not subject to the state retirement system. We are required to provide free and appropriate public education through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. And we have to do that in the least restrictive environment as determined by the IEP team. And these are the costs are the responsibility of the resident district. Transportation, so you just saw tonight our payment in lieu of transportation. So the District of Residence is responsible for transportation to and from charter and private schools if travel time is 30 minutes or less from the student's residence. Bell times and school calendars are not able to be regulated. Our transportation department plans around 10 separate school calendars every year for transportation. And if we can't provide transportation, we are required to make payments in lieu of that transportation service being provided. So out of our 119 total bus and van routes, 31 routes include schools to other schools other than Westerville. All right. That wasn't as long as I thought it would be. Okay, that's my presentation. So I just wanted to give that backstory. I've presented various versions of this to different groups, and I just thought it would be helpful for the board to see this presentation. So what you have in front of you, that first page with the peach color is, this is the estimated cost to homeowners. It's the same that we had on that slide there, back there, that has the millage amount. The market value is determined by the county auditor based on 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, 400,000, and 500,000. I wanted to give everybody a wide range, and then the estimated annual revenue. The next page is the current forecast estimate with no levy in 2024. And as you can see, the current forecast is estimating a deficit spending each year of the forecast. I do want to mention 2024 would not be deficit spending if not for the transfer, because of that transfer is included in that amount. But large deficit spending is going throughout the forecast period without any additional levy. The next page is what that would look like if voters approved a 3.9 mil levy. That would result, if everything held in the forecast, as true days cash before any reserves in fiscal year 2028 of the forecast at 75 days, and then unreserved of 54 days. The next one is 4.9 mils. That would result, if everything held true, at 95 days true days cash in fiscal year 2028. So when we talk about true days cash, we're talking about if we didn't receive any more revenues, how many days could we keep the doors open? And then 74 days unreserved true days cash. And then the next one is 5.9 mils, which would show 114 days true days cash before any reserves, and then 93 days unreserved. And then the last one is 6.9 mils at 134 days and 113 days of unreserved. Does everybody understand what's being presented there?
Question, Nicole, and I'm sorry I didn't ask you this before, I should have. True days cash, how is that determined? When we think about true days cash, is that based on current program?
That's in each year of the forecast that you're looking at. That is based on
Okay,
the expenses in each year.
okay, thank you. The reason I ask that is because obviously, you know, when cuts happen, that would change that true days cash, but it would also decimate the educational program.
Right. That's true. So my recommendation to the board, as you're reviewing this, is to consider a 4.9 mil levy. That would put us under where we were in 2019. So that is the third page in what I gave you. That would generate approximately $20 million a year. We would still be considered deficit spending based on the projections that we have. But it would put us in a place to be, I think, fiscally responsible with the number of days in cash. So once we roll into the next year of the forecast, so this is May, this year ends June 30th, we'll come back in November and we'll have 29 on this forecast. And so that's going to be another year out without knowing what the budget bill is going to look like and all that. So I do think that that's going to, I think that would be the most responsible place to be based on what we're seeing now. We have over $10 million that's being supplanted this year into ESSER funds that's going to be returning back to the general fund next year. And I don't know how we would continue to sustain our current programming without an additional operating levy. And so I would be comfortable with that 4.9 mil amount.
And I just wanted to add to that, I know we've talked about the deficit spending, and I don't think anybody likes deficit spending, but one of the reasons we're able to recommend the lower millage amount is because we do have that offset from the ESSER funding.
Yeah.
And so wanting to be able to use some of that surplus versus asking for more from the taxpayers.
Right,
Because it
exactly.
was able to offset and push the need out a little bit, which has been helpful.
Yeah, we had originally planned on being back in November of 2023, but because of the ESSER funds, we were able to extend that another year.
A question for you, Nicole.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that, so revenues are less than the expenditures for all years that are represented on here, 2024 through 2028.
Yeah.
Are we spending down like a balance to cover that?
We would be spending down a balance.
Okay.
For the duration of the forecast period.
Okay.
And that's kind of what we were just alluding to. So we were able to get that balance because of the ESSER funding. And so instead of asking for more, we wanted to spend that down some.
Okay.
I would also ask Nicole, I know you kind of mentioned it during the presentation, but could you also talk about, because you talk, just so everybody's clear, when you talk about that transfer out that's making us be in a deficit this year, is really to offset having to ask for more bond money. Could you maybe talk about that a little bit more,
Yeah,
please?
so we did talk about this a little bit in another work session, but we have, we have the second part of the facilities master plan that we've been discussing and the 4 buildings that we've landed on. Based on the estimated cost for those 4 buildings, we think that the bond millage that we have rolling off, so we have an old bond millage that the last payment is in 2027. Today, the millage is it's collecting at 1.7 mils. It won't be that same millage in 2027, but it's essentially a $6.3 million payment that we can cover without asking for additional millage from the community. And so that will generate about $140 million for a bond project for us, which essentially covers the 4 buildings that we talked about. But we know that we have needs above those 4 buildings, and so the idea was to take that balance out of the general fund, put it into a capital projects fund to cover those other needs so that we could do a no new millage ask for the bond issue piece of that. So the additional would be in the operating, but we would be spending that on one-time costs that wouldn't be recurring costs for the bond piece. Does that make sense?
So as I'm looking at it as a combination, if you will. What we need to do is look at what is the level that we need to spend down the balance that we currently have and combine that with the millage that we believe we need. So in my mind, it's a question of what is the appropriate trajectory for spending down the balance, and how then does that balance with the amount of mills that we need to keep the educational program as it should be, and still spending the balance down. The idea is, I think, where a lot of people may wonder what we're up to, when you look at our financials, we have a large cash balance. And that suggests to people that we don't need any money. But if you just rely only on that cash balance, what we're actually doing is pushing the need for, it's kind of like a tsunami. They push the need out, and all of a sudden the wave from the tsunami is huge at the end, and you end up with massive amount of millage that's needed after you have spent down the balance. So that's why I say it's got to be like a combo plate, and you got to, combo plates and tsunamis, that's a mixed metaphor for sure, but the idea of combining those two at an appropriate trajectory so that you don't end up with that tsunami of millage that's needed at the end.
Yeah, and a lot of districts are dealing with this exact thing because of the ESSER funds. And so the state is calling it a fiscal cliff from those funds, just because that's a large amount of one-time funding that's just going away, right?
But it has kept us off the ballot.
But it has
so-
kept us off the ballot. And the way school funding works, we always operate on a bell curve, right? So we see an increase in funding, but then it drops down a little bit, and then it comes back up, and then it drops. I mean, that is how, if you go back and look at state funding, federal funding, I mean, that's how we that's how we generally operate, is on that bell curve. And so this forecast, like I mentioned, we have projections for state funding based on 2025 levels. We obviously will continue to advocate to the state to fully fund Westerville schools. We're in a weird space because of the way property taxes work. Like, Angie was talking about Central Ohio, we're seeing that growth, right, that not the rest of the state is doing. And so there's a provision in law that's called the 20 mil floor, and it won't let a school district go below 20 mils. So we're over 40 mils, right? So we're nowhere near that 20 mil floor, but over 400 districts in the state are at the 20 mil floor. And so for them, when values increase, that's an increase in funding for those schools. But that's not the case in Westerville, that's not the case in Worthington, that's not the case in Dublin or Olentangy or New Albany. But outside of here, that's the case for a lot of schools. And so what we're also dealing with is the state looking at property tax reform. They have a committee that's been looking at it, and I don't know what they're going to come up with out of that. But I do know that they've been very mindful, at least in the conversations, about their policies have created the situation that we live in. We have a shortage of housing supply. The tax incentives have all gone towards commercial and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know what the state's going to do. We'll continue to advocate that they fairly fund public schools, but we can see that they've sort of just focused on private schools lately, which is unfortunate.
So when we think about, 5-year forecast, right, there are all these variables out there. And one of those is, what's the funding going to look like from the state? Other variables include there's potential for mandates, right, that cost money or.
Yeah.
So I guess, are there mandates potentially on the horizon that, the team's aware of? And that, maybe the answer to that is no. I just wanted to ask the question. But the other piece is, our cost increases depend on our student need. And so we saw during COVID a great explosion in, mental health services need and so on. looking at special ed numbers. So I'm just wondering if our teaching and learning and operational folks can talk about where you see potential need, that I know you all have worked to build some of these things into the forecast, but I just want us to understand that, like, to have a conversation about how our student population is dynamic and the needs change over time. So how are some of those needs changing now?
I think just one interesting area to look at, just as a kind of a snapshot view, is the growth of our Early Learning Center preschool program. We have about 383 students participating in that program. We've never had over 300. So that's 100 students in a single year's growth. And so when you start thinking about the student needs for that particular student population, it greatly changes the course of the district staffing plan. So, you know, that's just one little instance in the grand scheme of things. And so while our overall enrollment has remained relatively stable for the last few years, our special ed numbers have increased. And so, as Nicole showed you that graph earlier, that was the October number for fiscal year 24. Our May number is much higher than any other bar that was on that graph right now. Tremendous amount of growth this year.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So, and if there are other areas, you know, I'd be happy to hear about them. I think special ed is one we think a lot about. So that's where, you know, when you think of the cost of educating a pupil, right, one student, that kind of change, when you average it out over students, that average cost is going to come up when we have higher need. So I'm just so we can give ourselves and anybody who's made it this far in watching us an image of that, can we just talk for a moment about when special education need increases? It's probably obvious to most people, but why does that cost more, right? Where are the costs coming from?
I think just if you look at just some of our SLCs, you know, a typical classroom next year, general ed classroom is going to have a class average right around 24 to 25 students. But an SLC is a significantly smaller number of students. We might have 6 to 8 students in an SLC, but those students also require instructional aids to support them, and then some other related services. So as those numbers grow, our staffing grows differently than having to add another first grade classroom somewhere across the district. So, for example, we are adding 8 elementary school level SLCs next year, and those SLCs are going to require classroom teachers, they're going to require instructional aids, and then related services to go along with them. And that's just our growth as it's measured right now, today, which is different than it was 3 weeks ago with all the spring evaluations coming in.
And to hit into Carrie Dennis's area there, not only is it staffing, but then also, I know we spoke at a previous work session, it's also the space that's needed for that and how those are furnished. So if you want to talk about that a little bit, Carrie?
Yeah, so as we look at it, it's also what spaces within the buildings need to have furniture, need to have technology, phones. There's a lot of the operations side that goes into it. Then you also look at busing, MyVan programs. You have a need to support these students differently in our outdoor spaces. And when we look at accessibility for this population and the growth across our district, is us also trying to carve out and be very intentional about how we address our playgrounds and our parking lots.
Thanks.
And I think Mr. Dorn kind of laid that out for special education, but that's true even downstairs with our preschool, because when we add staff for the students, we need related services on top of them. So it's not just adding a staff member, it's adding several staff members. As Nicole displayed on her graphs, 1 out of every 10 of our students in Westerville schools are English learners, whose many of their families don't speak any English at all. And so there are services that we need to provide with them, from teaching to paraprofessionals. And you look at, we're at an all-time high. Our poverty has crossed 40% based on that graph. And there are other pieces and parts of that that hit the social emotional wellness piece, the family engagement, the social worker piece. And so despite the fact that our numbers have remained flat. Our challenges have grown in terms of the services that we want to provide our students, so that all of our students have the access to the programming and the experiences that we have. And that's probably a great bulk of our expenditure rise.
Yep. The services we want to provide, and in many cases, we are legally required to provide, right? So, okay, thank you.
Do we know what the median, not mean, the median home value is, home market value is in the district?
I do not know what that number is today,
That's fine.
but I can get that and report back.
Okay,
It's changed, I know,
yes.
last time I looked at it.
If I could hop back, just one more thing about increased student needs, and just thinking about non-public schools, right? So I don't know if we know why our special education numbers are increasing at the rate they're increasing at. I'd be interested if we have thoughts on that. But I just want to point out that we educate all children, and private schools do not. Though they don't have to, they're not required to. And so we love all the children that are here. We want to do, meet their needs. And I just am pointing out the obvious, which is that all the state funding that's going to private schools, those schools don't have to take every student. If they, they can say they can't meet their needs.
Well, and we also spend funds, I don't know, it's quite a bit or whatever, on students that live within our school district, especially within our title school district, that go to other private places. And all of our title schools are at the elementary level, so if we have students that have reading needs or other needs that live within the boundaries of our title but do not go to Westerville City Schools, and we have some that go to schools as far away as Riverside Hospital, that we are required to provide services for. We have 3 or 5 full-time Westerville City Schools employees at St. Paul. I want to say 5. Not sure, it's 3 or 5. It's one of those. But that's just an example, and we have several of our reading specialists who leave our buildings to go to a non-public building to educate students who live within our boundaries but are not our students. So it's not only do our funding go there, our own resources are used to provide services for some of our non-public students.
Great point, thank you.
So I do just want to mention that we've had several work sessions around priorities and different things like that. And I think the district's done a really nice job of supporting students, at least definitely over the years I've been here, and I'm sure many years before I got here. We have expanded the opportunity for support around our mental health services. I know we've grown our MTSS program, our 504 supports, all things that you're seeing which was championed by Governor DeWine with the student success and well-being dollars, that the district's already been doing a great job of supporting over the years. But we just see those needs continue to grow and grow and grow.
So what are our next steps? What are you?
If the board is comfortable with my recommendation of the 4.9 mils, I would bring a resolution back to you. So we would have to do a special needs resolution for the bond piece. So that would be on our June 10th meeting. And then
our resolution of necessity for the ballot issue overall would be the June 24th meeting, and then a resolution to proceed. I would take that resolution of necessity, have the amounts and rates certified by the county auditor, bring it back, resolution to proceed in July, and then file with the Board of Elections, should the board approve it. And then that would put us on the ballot in November. We did pass a resolution for the library to be on the ballot in November, so they'll be on the ballot. And just a reminder that that is separate from us. They have their own budget, their own fund, their own board. We're just a mechanism for them to have a property tax levy that we're required to do.
So are you looking for each of us to give you feedback tonight?
Well, if I don't hear any objection, that will be the resolution that I will propose come June 24th.
Okay. I'm supportive.
Speak now or forever hold your peace. Please.
I've told you, oh, darn it. I've told you that I struggle with 4.9. That I lean more toward 3.9. So, yeah, 4.9 is a stretch for me, purely as I think about tax burden on the community. So, yeah, I'm struggling with 4.9. I understand that that's the recommendation. I understand why it's the recommendation. I think the reasons for the recommendation are good. But as I look at the trajectories I was talking about, I still tend to go toward 3.9.
Yes, we had this conversation.
Yes, we did.
So I
And we're
just,
still friends.
yeah,
Yes.
we are, we're still friends. We're still here. So I just want to mention, this district has a history of getting into, if a levy fails, then significant cuts, right? I think there was a long history, and I know, Nancy, you were on the board for some of that. In 2009, we had to shift the payroll date because of cash flows over a fiscal year. And I think the district went through a long period of austerity measures, just sort of gutting the middle school program is essentially what happened. I think the districts worked really hard to build a lot of that back up. I've benefited from that with my own kid in our middle school programs. Engineering is like her favorite thing ever after experiencing that this year. So I think I wouldn't want to get to a place where we would have to look at cutting some of that back in the future for our students. When we were on the ballot in 2019, and I was relatively new to the district, I moved here in 2018, I remember talking to folks that they shared with me, I was so excited to take this class, and I didn't get to take it because the district had to, like my sister took it before me, but by the time I got to middle school, I didn't get to take it because the district had to make cuts. And that was just really hard to hear, a whole generation essentially that lost opportunities for having experiences that a lot of the districts around us get. They have those experiences too. And I would never want to get back. I view my role as ensuring that we're responsible to our taxpayers, that we are appropriately spending their funds, 12 years clean audits, FYI, we're doing a good job. And that our kids have all the resources they need to have access to a quality education, right? So not everyone shows up with the same needs, and so it's our responsibility to meet those needs. And I would never want to put us in a situation where we wouldn't be able to meet those needs. So that's why I recommend 4.9.
And I don't disagree with a single word you said, except that last sentence. And I think that I'm looking at it through a very similar lens. I have had to live through and participate in more than one round of what I consider to be amputations to the educational program. And I remember all too well things that went away that never came back. And so as I look at the responsibility of the taxpayers, the responsibility of the system, the responsibility of the future, I'm also looking at how do I best seek to avoid decimation, amputation, because things don't come back. And it's always difficult to determine a millage level to go forward with, and it always has multiple layers. But as I think about past histories and past cuts and future needs and future desires, I struggle with 4.9. So that's just where my mind is. We are both in the same spot. We're just looking at it slightly differently. And it's 1 mil.
Ms. Marshall, you've given us estimated cost to homeowners, so could you just take a moment to talk through from there the difference between 3.9 and 4.9 from a homeowner's point of view? We'll just pick like the middle number, 300,000, on the chart.
So a 3.9 mil for a $300,000 home would be an annual cost of $409.50. And for a 4.9 mil, it would be $514.50.
So annually, we're talking $105 difference on a $300,000 home. I just think it helps to think about, what our taxpayers will,
Yeah, that's why I was asking what the
What's the
median
difference? Yeah.
value is,
yeah. And for me, because, we've been thinking about this for a long time, I am supportive of 4.9 for the reasons that you mentioned, because I don't want to get us into that situation again. And $105 is, it's an amount of money. I mean, it's a significant amount of money. But to me, that feels worth it, just in terms of being able to continue providing the kind of education that we're providing now. And my hope would be that would mean we could push out the next, ask a little bit. So. The levy cycle is tiresome because of the way
Yes.
funding works in this state.
That's unfortunate.
It is
for sure.
tiresome. Yeah.
You are, Nicole, the expert at the numbers, you and your team, and I think you guys have done a fantastic job of getting us to the point that we're at now. And it has been 5 years since we've been on the ballot, right? 2019? Yeah. So 5 years. And my personal point of view is if you're recommending the 4.9 because that's where we need to be able to continue to provide the same level of services, I am good with that. I do, there is a lot of talk about inflation and the cost of everything is up and, people are worried about that, and I get that. But if something like this doesn't pass, the services will go away. Some of these services will go away. Some of the things that we've had planned will not happen. So I think we're just going to have to make sure that we're educating and really talking to the voters about the value of this and reminding them, and I will keep reminding people, we are in this situation because of the state legislature. If you don't like this, vote differently for your state legislative candidates, because that's why we're in this never-ending circle, is because they cannot figure out a way to fund this properly. And it's
So I think the state knows how to fund this properly. I think they choose not to. They continue to lower the state income taxes,
Yeah.
which is not costing us businesses in Ohio. You can hear any of Governor DeWine's speeches where he talked about how wonderful we're doing on the business front. I mean, we got Intel to come here, right? I do think it would be helpful if we had some people help us advocate at the state level. Angie and I have been talking about starting I don't know if we'll call it a committee or what, sort of an opportunity, just having an opportunity for folks to come in and learn about things. So I am working with the Finance Committee, that we've been educating them on a lot of these things. And hopefully we will have an opportunity for some advocacy at the state level about them realizing how important it is to fund schools properly.
Yeah, I think that the average person just going about their life and doing their thing has no idea what the split is between state funding and local funding. And I think some of the slides that you had shared about what that looks like and how it is increased to the homeowners over time are really impactful.
Well, and I will tell you, the conversation around the property tax reform, at least some of the legislators that I know were part of creating policy around that caused this shift over time, I do think that they are recognizing it, which is helpful. But whether they'll do anything about it is a different conversation, for sure. That's all I had.
Well, thank you. Thanks for
Thank
the
you.
great information. Thank you to the cabinet for being here for conversation. Appreciate that.